Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. So we're going to start with our chapter 2 Culture, Identity, and Socialization crash course. Okay, so we'll start with what is culture. This is the central idea of the chapter. So, culture are the things shared by the members of a society, learned behavior, which is language, beliefs, values, norms, customs, roles, and skills which make up a way of life of any society. We often hear people say that this is our culture. We also say that. So, if we break down culture, then culture constitutes a number of things that are associated with you. So, there are clothes. So, if we apply the understanding of culture to the Pakistani context, then what is culture for Pakistan? If somebody asks you to define the culture of Pakistan, so then in clothes you say that in clothes we have shalwar kameez. So in music we have different kinds of music genres. We have hip hop, we have classical, we have rock, and then we have certain religious and cultural festivals. So religious festivals include Eid, and cultural festivals include Basant. And then coming on to our language, so we say that we have English, Urdu, Pashto, Punjabi, Saraiki. So these are all languages that are also part of our culture. So now we move on to diversity and variation in human behavior. So previously we had discussed the understanding of culture specific to the context of Pakistan. But we all know that due to the rise of digital technology and the internet and social media, the world is getting smaller and smaller, and we are interconnected to each other, which was not the case probably 2 to 3 decades ago. Okay, so now we've seen an emergence of a global culture. So what does global culture really mean? So global culture literally means a culture that is shared across the world by a number of people. So you see the idea of McDonaldization, or you see the Disney or Coca-Cola. So they've become famous brands, and they basically are spreading throughout the globe. If you need to understand it more easily, then if you're traveling to UK or the USA or even to Saudi Arabia, then if you're talking to somebody about Disney, obviously if you know about Disney, then they will also know about Disney, and also about McDonald's or other things. So we have a shared understanding of the world due to greater connectivity and due to the rise of internet. So now we move on to the idea of cultural relativism, and cultural relativism became a popular idea when these sociologists began to study people from other societies. And cultural relativism is a term which says that you need to understand someone else's culture from their lens, their perspective. So what does this mean? So I'd like to give you an example. So if you study Amish people, then there are studies which show that Amish people reject modern life, they reject technology, they place high value on rural life, they don't believe in telephones or the internet. If you're not seeing the Amish people from a culturally relativistic perspective, then you are going to judge them. That they're they're people who are less civilized than you, they're people who are backward from you because they don't know about the current global affairs that are going on in the world. So what cultural relativist would say you is that you need to see their culture from their perspective, which is not exotic, which is their culture, which are their values, that they don't like internet because they want to stay more connected to nature. So a cultural relativistic perspective would negate the idea that they are backward or they're somewhat exotic or uncivilized people than you. So here I've mentioned the cultural relativism really frees you from ethnocentrism and judgment. Ethnocentrism may seem like a heavy term for you, but ethnocentrism is really that you are judging the other person from your perspective. For example, the white person, they came to the colony, for example, they came to colonize Africa. So they saw the culture of African people as somewhat uncivilized, or it was based on myths. But if the colonizer at that time would have seen their culture from a culturally relativistic perspective, then they would have known there are certain reasons behind why they believe in these myths, why they're practicing a certain religion. Sociologists mainly advocate that we need to study other person's culture and their way of life from a relativistic perspective, from their perspective, from their lens. Another term that became popular in the recent decades is the idea of multiculturalism. So, multiculturalism describes the manner in which a given society deals with cultural diversity. So, based on the underlying assumptions, members from different cultures can coexist. So people who are advocates of multiculturalism, they basically say that people belonging to a range of ethnicities, cultures, and religions can coexist in a society peacefully. Multiculturalism comes with the idea that there are multiple cultures in one area. So, for example, UK has Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and English people, plus others such as African and Asians. So, integration takes place when the dominant culture prevails and people from other cultures lose their identity. Multiculturalism happens when people from other minorities, they lose their identity and they get assimilated, or their cultures become a part of the dominant culture that is a part of the society. You see that India is also a culturally diverse society in which diversity includes that there are Muslims, there are Hindus, there are Christians, there are Buddhists, but you see that Hindus are the main majority. Hindus are in majority, whereas Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims are in minority. Proponents of multiculturalism who say that there is no sign that India will split or that one dominant culture will take over. So that's really the beauty of multiculturalism, which the proponents say that the minority religions they lose some part of their identity and give it to the dominant culture, and they exist peacefully, coexist in the society. So there are certain criticisms against the proponents of multiculturalists who say that this approach is too idealistic. Obviously, we see that people from minorities are being, even in Pakistan, we see that how we are a intolerant society and people from other minorities get killed or they're persecuted or they're not respected as we should. But so they say that it's too idealistic because there are certain tensions. So now we move on to the heart of a topic, and these are some of the important terms that I've listed down. There are other important terms too, but this is just a crash course, so I'll be covering main terms only. So you need to understand these terms in order to proceed further and have a good understanding of the chapter. So first we have identity. Identity literally means how do you define yourself, okay, and who you are. So obviously we all have multiple identities. Somebody, for example, you're not just female or not just male. So for example, with female you're also a daughter, you're also a student, you're also a Muslim, you also belong to a certain caste. Yeah, so you see that you have multiple identities. So how do you define yourself? With your name or with other identities that I've listed. Okay, now we move on to status. So status is literally the social position that somebody holds in the society, and this is going to be determined by your class, caste, gender, ethnicity, etc. So there are other variables too, your age, for example. So by class, we often say that somebody who's more wealthy or somebody who owns land, they belong to the higher social status. They have a higher social status, they belong to the elite group. So moving on to role. So definition of role is very easy, and also it can be applied to your own context. These are the patterns of expected behaviors. For example, if I am teaching you, then I am a teacher. So I am going to play the role of a teacher. And then you're playing the role of a student, and then we see our mothers playing the role of a mother. So there are certain patterns of behavior that are expected from certain roles. A teacher is going to teach, a student is going to learn, ask questions, or get involved in deeper inquiry. So that is going to vary with each role. Moving on to values. So values are the standards that are established by the society to distinguish between what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. For example, A universal value that we all hold is that we all need to be honest. So moving on to norms. So norms are behavior that people expect from each other. For example, when you talk to your friend or your teacher or your mother or your father, then a universal norm that everybody expects you to hold and the other person to hold as well is that you must respect them. You must be engaged in a respectful conversation or a respectful behavior. So that is the universal norm. So I know students get confused between norms and values. So a basic distinction between norms and values is that norms are basically rooted on behaviors, something that you showcase, something that is seen, that is visible. But values are what you hold. Values are what you believe in. So now we move on to beliefs. So beliefs are what people hold true. For example, people believe in God, or people also believe in the idea of democracy, or people also believe in the idea of civil liberty. So these are your own beliefs. People believe in the idea of gender equality. People believe that society should be in class equality. These are your certain beliefs, and they may be exclusive, and they are exclusive from person to person. Okay, so now moving on to another very important concept in this chapter is the idea of primary and secondary socialization. So first we need to understand what really socialization means. Socialization really means that by learning the customs and the values of the society, you become competent members, and by learning these values you can function very well in the society. So primary socialization is the first hand socialization. For example, from the day you're born, your first encounter is with your family. In family you learn certain values. You learn your gender. You're told to speak in a certain way, sit in a certain way, or talk to elders with respect. Your socialization is happening through your family. And secondary socialization is really the introduction to the wider society that connects your personal realm, that connects your personal sphere with the social realm. So school acts as a bridge that basically connects you with the wider society. So it introduces you to the ideas of patriarchy, or to the ideas of democracy, to the idea of gender equality. And over here the socialization is more objective, it's not subjective. And over here it introduces you to the idea of meritocracy, that you need to work hard, you need to be responsible, you need to be punctual, and play a larger role in the society. So that's your socialization. Okay, so I'll just run you through the agencies of socialization. Before, there is family and peers. So these are your primary sources of contact in your early childhood. And then you have secondary agencies of socialization, including schools, religion, and media. Okay, so how does media act as an agency of socialization? So when you're young, you watch cartoons, and when you grow old, you watch TV series and other dramas, and through these, there are certain messages that we get. For example, the ideas about fashion, about lifestyle, or even about our own gender roles. How you see that it's the male who's always going out and earning money, and there's the female who's always in the kitchen cooking for the husband. So you see that how gender roles are socialized into you through these media, through media. And then how media may also portray the opposite, that is how media also may speak against the social ills of the society, that is the social ills of the society, for example the violence that is being carried out against women. Okay, so how do children learn social expectations? It's through the idea of negative and positive sanctions. So negative and sanctions are literally a tool that allow you to learn social expectations, or they are used as a tool by parents and by the wider society. So for example, if we move on to the main idea, to the very popular idea of how do we learn our gender, so you see that there are three ways. So how do these sanctions work? And over here we're only talking about informal sanctions. So they're not formal sanctions. And then we move on to manipulation. So manipulation is literally when you encourage certain activities or discourage certain activities. For example, you manipulate very latently, very silently. You manipulate you manipulate a girl that it's better that you stay at home, or you play with the dolls, or you play with your kitchen set, and you encourage the boy to get involved in physical activities. And then there is canalization. So canalization is literally when you push children towards a certain activity. For example, boys are encouraged towards football or girls are encouraged towards cooking. So you're basically pushing the child or encouraging the child that you need to form these certain activities. Now, canalization is simply when you push the child, when you say this activity is good for you. But manipulation is when you give reasons, when you give your own self-constructed reasons. For example, girls should cook because they are the ones who only have to handle the household once they get married. So, and then there are verbal appellations. So verbal appellations are literally, for example, when you do something wrong, then you're going to get reprimanded, then you're going to get scolded. If a child is creating some mess in the room, then obviously her mother is going to reprimand and could scold them not to do the certain act. Or for example, if you are always using your phone all the time, then your mother may scold you not to use phone all the time. These are some of the informal sanctions. So informal sanctions, in informal sanctions you have positive sanctions as well as negative sanctions. And in positive sanctions you have when you are encouraged to form a certain behavior, a certain act, or to behave in a certain way. But in negatives you include verbal application. But on the other side you have formal sanctions too, which can be good and bad. So in formal sanctions you have for example, when you go to school, in formal good sanctions you have when you given awards for overachieving, or when you are appreciated by the teacher, or when you are given badges for being punctual to school. But informal would include detentions, they would include punishments, fines. So these are some of the bad sanctions, negative sanctions. Okay, so now we move on to the debate of nature versus nurture. According to some sociologists, our socialization is dependent on nature. So, according to them, everything is biologically inherited. Your eye color, just like your eye color, hair, face structure, your intelligence, and even somebody who manifests criminal behavior, all of this is naturally determined. So by nature they're like that. For example, you say that by nature somebody is good at leadership. And there they pointed out, for example, if you take the example of gender, so the gender roles are divided naturally. So you see that men are the breadwinners and women are the one who are working at home. This is the natural division, and this is how nature works. Individuals learn to interact. So through nature, individuals learn the way that men have to go outside and women have to stay inside their home, because they have to stay in the private sphere to take care of the children. So they believe that the arrangements, your familiar arrangements or your gender arrangements, everything is determined by nature. However, there are strong criticisms against these approaches, and these people are basically called biological determinists, who only believe that all socialization happens through nature, and they basically disregard this nurture perspective, the ideas of primary socialization and secondary socialization, how humans learn to smile, or they learn to imitate the other person, or they learn to eat. Everything is nurtured into us. Or the idea that humans learn and then they evolve. And previously I gave you the example of gender, how they said that gender is naturally determined and there is a gender binary. However, there is a sociologist called Anne Oakley, and so she says that now we have women who are working and also who are taking care of their homes, and there are men, the idea of new fathers who are also taking care of the child and working. And she also says that the idea of gender, it's in itself is a social construction. So from the day you're born, you're socialized into, girls are socialized that girls are socialized or given specific kinds of toys. They're given pink dolls, or they basically wear pink colors, or they're encouraged to like pink colors. And boys are given these Lego toys, and girls are given kitchen sets. So from the point that you're born, your socialization starts. So I'm specifically talking about gender socialization. So it starts from there, from the toys you're given, the kind of clothes you wear, and then comes your career. So mostly girls are encouraged to pursue medicine, whereas boys are encouraged to do engineering, become astronauts or physicists, or join military, but girls aren't. The nature versus nurture debate. So nature are the one who believe that people are born geniuses or people are born leaders, whereas nurture, people who believe in the nurture debate, or to the nurture side, they say that no, we learn all these characteristics. You learn to become a great leader, or you learn the hard way to be intelligent or to succeed at anything. Okay, just to illustrate the nurture side and to how people have critiqued it and also carried out social experiments to prove the idea that through nurturing, you learn to socialize with the society and you learn to interact with the society. So, the example or the experiment that they carried out was of feral children. So feral children are known as wild children, and from the day they were born, they basically were sent to these jungles. So feral children are the people who are the children who lived in jungles, okay, and they didn't live with real humans like we do. So they were known as wild children due to inadequate socialization when children are unfit into the society. So you see that these children were the wild children, and more like you see stories of Mowgli, who stays in jungles and who leaps from tree to tree and who eats with their foot and doesn't know how to walk on their 2 feet, but don't know how to stand erect or how even to smile, how to even eat. The studies have shown us, some stories that we have heard of, or the studies, they have shown us that most feral children have difficulty in language. They find it hard to adopt normal food, don't like wearing conventional clothing, so they wear these leaves around their private parts. So, and they may not walk upright, and they may not socialize, and cannot even use the toilet properly. So you see that how they're not properly nurtured, because they do not know how to talk, eat, walk, or even interact with people, obviously. So like we do. So we are nurtured into this specific process. I talking to you in a specific way, or using a certain language, or interacting with my peers or with my family in a certain way. It's because I've learned it, because that's instilled into me, drilled into me through different practices and habits. I'd like to illustrate an example. Already I've given you an example of gender, how gender is socially constructed, but here we're going to cover age, because children 100 years ago today were treated as adults, and they were socialized into the same ideas of death and violence that were provided to adults and that were provided to adults. So they knew about death and violence. They were working. So 500 years ago, and even when industrial revolution was going on in Britain, there were children who were working in factories or in mines, and they were working alongside adults. So they were like little adults. But recently, with the advent of these education systems and with the development of industry, individuals needed to have these literate and numerate skills, and needed to know how to work with the machinery and how to carry out this whole paperwork of appointing people, of carrying out this managerial work. So these structures came into being of university, of education systems. So then these children, and obviously many countries had imposed a ban on child labor, and children and these little adults were recognized as children. And there were bans imposed, the child labor bans imposed in many countries, where it was banned that the children below the age of 13, 14, they will not work in mines or brick kilns or any other area, because that is the time that they need to be nurtured and they need to go to school. This is the time that we are also experiencing. So this was childhood in itself was a social construction which happened alongside our society evolved, and and then we see progress. Obviously, children at the age of 3 are going to nursery schools, and then there is preschool, and then secondary school, and obviously higher up. And then we have this childhood became as a childhood was recognized as a category with schools, obviously, and secondly with the capitalist production that was centered on child consumption. So now your industry was also producing certain things that were only centered, or they were only targeting children. The toy industry, or the clothing industry, or the shoes industry. Okay, lastly, we move on to the idea of the constituents of our social identity. So like we discussed before, our social identity is based on a multiplicity of different other identities, which will include age, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, culture, and age. Now, I'd like to point out that each identity, the multiplicity of factors that we're talking about, they're going to vary from society to society. For example, how gender is perceived in Britain is different from how it's perceived in Pakistan. And to give examples from your textbook, or from sociology textbook of Jonathan Blundell. So traditionally we see that women are the one who's staying at home and men are the one who are going out. But this traditional society is a Murdu grammar people who basically whose men and women both went to war. And Tangible society, you had women who left villages to work. About how at that time, how variations of gender may exist in different societies and in different tribes or different communities. So I've given you the example of Mudu grammar or the Tangible. Both were different from how traditionally gender is perceived. Another example that I would like to discuss with you is about the idea of age and identity. Is about the idea of class and identity. How do people identify themselves alongside their class backgrounds? So identity is really, social identity is how you perceive yourself. So and for example, if somebody belongs to the upper class or to the upper middle class, they're going to have different hobbies and different interests than people who belong to the working class. Upper class people will have different cultural interests. For example, they'll be interested in Shakespeare, or they'll be interested in theater and drama and these these activities that are not activities or cultural interests that are not available to the masses. So what are the masses? The masses are the people who were working class, whose cultural interests are classified as being cheap, as they're involved in seeing they're not reading literature or going to museums like the upper middle class goes to, because they're working all day. So the idea of how people identify themselves based on their class backgrounds. So the upper class will identify themselves as being more civilized, as being more modern and up to date, whereas working class will identify themselves as dependent, or as people who lack these cultural traits and they need to do more. They will consider themselves to be somewhat relatively less modern than the upper class. So your class also gives you a certain kind of identity of how you how you identify yourself. Another example that I would like to discuss with you is about the idea of class and identity. How do people identify themselves alongside their class backgrounds? So identity is really, social identity is how you perceive yourself. So and for example, if somebody belongs to the upper class or to the upper middle class, they're going to have different hobbies and different interests than people who belong to the working class. So upper class people will have different cultural interests. For example, they'll be interested in Shakespeare, or they'll be interested in theater and drama and these these activities that are not activities or cultural interests that are not available to the masses. So what are the masses? The masses are the people who are working class, whose cultural interests are classified as being cheap. They're not reading literature or going to museums like the upper middle class goes to, because they're working all day. So the idea of how people identify themselves based on their class background. So the upper class will identify themselves as being more civilized, as being more modern and up to date, whereas working class will identify themselves as dependent or as people who lack these cultural traits. Class also gives you a certain kind of identity of how you how you identify yourself. To sum it up, if you basically sum it up, you most probably people would identify themselves as belonging to a certain caste, to a certain age group, and to a certain religion, and then to a certain culture. You belong to the Punjabi culture or the Balochi culture, and to a certain gender. So yeah, so the main point is that our identity is not just one. We're not just females, we're not just males. We are a mix of identities, and this is how we define ourselves in different situations. Lastly, I would request you all to please subscribe my channel, because this gives me a lot of motivation to continue the series. And because of so many requests, I had to compile this video. I had to take out time from a busy schedule. So thank you for your love and support on my first video on theories and methods. And because of your comments, I am able to record this. Otherwise, I wouldn't have any motivation to record this. But thank you all. And please do share any kind of feedback, because this is my first time at teaching and I want constructive feedback, be it good or bad, I don't mind. But I want real honest feedback. And thank you all for listening.